Sometimes the quietest warning is the one that saves the most lives. Friday evening brought the familiar rush to Ashford Grill, one of Manhattan's busiest restaurants, where polished glasses reflected warm golden light and conversations blended into a steady rhythm of laughter, clinking silverware, and soft jazz drifting from hidden speakers. Every table was occupied. Every server moved with practiced precision. Grace Mitchell tied the strings of her crisp white apron behind her black waitress uniform before stepping onto the dining room floor with the same calm smile she wore every shift. Regular customers greeted her by name because she remembered the smallest details that others overlooked. She knew who preferred sparkling water instead of still, who disliked onions, who celebrated anniversaries every October, and who secretly appreciated an extra slice of warm bread after a difficult day. Her greatest strength was not speed. It was attention. She noticed everything without making anyone feel watched. Near the large windows overlooking the city lights, Ethan Walker entered the restaurant holding the hand of his 9-year-old son, Noah. The billionaire could have reserved an entire private dining room almost anywhere in New York, but every Friday belonged to his son, and Noah loved the simple comfort of Ashford Grill. It was one place where people treated them like a father and his child instead of headlines in a business magazine. Grace welcomed them with genuine warmth and guided them to their favorite booth. Noah smiled as she handed him the children's menu, even though she already knew he would order grilled chicken with mashed potatoes. Ethan thanked her with a quiet nod before helping his son settle into the booth. The evening felt ordinary in every possible way. Families celebrated birthdays. Couples shared desserts beneath candlelight. Friends laughed over coffee. Grace moved gracefully from table to table, balancing trays with effortless confidence while exchanging kind words with every guest. Then something changed. Ethan noticed a man sitting alone several tables away. The guest had entered only minutes earlier, yet instead of reading the menu or looking around the dining room like everyone else, he appeared unusually tense and repeatedly checked inside his heavy coat while scanning the room. Ethan did not jump to conclusions. Years of leading large organizations had taught him that careful observation mattered more than assumptions. Still, something about the man's behavior felt different enough to deserve attention. Ethan looked toward Grace as she approached with fresh iced tea for another table. Their eyes met for only a second. Without attracting attention, he raised one hand beneath the edge of the table where almost no one else could see. Using calm, deliberate American Sign Language, he signed a short message meant only for someone who understood. He has a weapon. Watch carefully. Do not panic. Grace's eyes remained steady. She did not gasp. She did not freeze. She did not look toward the man. Instead, she gave the smallest, almost invisible nod before finishing exactly what she had already been doing. She placed the glasses gently on the table, smiled warmly at another family, and continued walking through the dining room as though nothing unusual had happened. Around her, hundreds of ordinary moments continued without interruption. No one noticed the silent exchange that had just taken place. No one realized that an entire room full of people remained peaceful because two strangers had chosen calm instead of fear. Ethan watched Grace disappear toward the service station, and for the first time that evening, he realized she had understood every single sign without hesitation. Grace continued across the dining room without changing her pace by even a single step. Years of working in a busy restaurant had taught her that people often watch the staff more closely than they realized. Any sudden movement, nervous glance, or change in expression could ripple through a crowded room faster than words. She kept her smile natural as she delivered a fresh basket of bread to a family celebrating a birthday, wished an elderly couple a pleasant evening, and quietly collected empty glasses from another table. Nothing about her behavior suggested that anything unusual had happened. Yet behind her calm expression, every detail of the room became sharper. She noticed the locations of every occupied table, the nearest exits, the manager speaking with the hostess near the entrance, and the security employee standing discreetly beside the reception desk. She also noticed the man Ethan had silently indicated. She never stared in his direction. Instead, she relied on reflections in the restaurant windows, polished mirrors, and the natural movement of serving nearby tables to quietly confirm what Ethan had observed. The guest appeared unusually distracted, frequently adjusting the heavy coat draped across one arm instead of relaxing like everyone else enjoying dinner. Grace resisted the temptation to make assumptions. Observation came first. Conclusions came later. At the same time, Ethan remained seated across from Noah, helping his son unfold a paper puzzle printed on the children's menu. His voice stayed warm and relaxed as they discussed school, baseball practice, and the science project Noah hoped to finish before Monday. Anyone watching them would see nothing more than a father enjoying dinner with his child. Only Grace understood that Ethan's attention never completely left the dining room. He continued speaking naturally while quietly monitoring the situation through the reflection in the restaurant window beside their booth. Noah looked up with a smile. "Dad, do you think I can finish this maze before dinner arrives?" Ethan smiled back. "I think you can finish 2 of them." The little boy laughed and bent over the page again, completely unaware that his father had chosen calm over fear to protect both him and everyone else nearby. Grace reached the service station and quietly greeted her manager as though asking an ordinary question about the evening schedule. While reviewing a printed order ticket together, she signed a brief message below waist level where customers could not see. Possible concern. Please ask security to quietly observe table 14. No emergency. Keep everyone comfortable. The manager had completed annual communication training with local emergency response professionals and understood immediately that discretion mattered. Without changing expression, he nodded once and walked toward the reception area carrying an empty serving tray as though preparing another table. Moments later, the restaurant's security employee casually began circulating through the dining room, smiling politely at guests while remaining completely unobtrusive. Around them, the evening continued with reassuring normality. Fresh meals arrived at tables. Soft jazz floated through hidden speakers. Birthday candles were lit for a young girl near the center of the room. Grace returned to serving coffee with the same gentle confidence she had displayed since the beginning of her shift. Ethan noticed every quiet decision she made. She never allowed anxiety to replace professionalism. She never drew attention to herself. Most importantly, she never allowed fear to become contagious. Watching her steady composure, Ethan realized that true courage often looked surprisingly ordinary. It sounded like a calm voice, moved with measured steps, and chose thoughtful action long before anyone else realized there was a reason to remain calm. The quiet coordination unfolding inside Ashford Grill remained invisible to every guest enjoying dinner that evening. Grace continued moving through the dining room with effortless confidence, balancing warm plates, refreshing drinks, and exchanging friendly smiles without revealing that every step now carried a second purpose. She was no longer simply serving meals. She was quietly observing the room while protecting the peaceful atmosphere every family deserved. Ethan noticed the remarkable discipline in the way she worked. She never looked directly toward the guest who had raised his concern. Instead, she used ordinary moments to gather information. As she refilled water glasses at a nearby table, she caught a brief reflection in the polished window. While delivering dessert to another family, she naturally noticed the man's posture from the corner of her vision. Every observation appeared accidental to anyone watching, yet together they created a careful picture of the situation. Meanwhile, the restaurant manager calmly greeted newly arriving guests at the entrance while subtly exchanging a few quiet words with the security employee. Nothing in their behavior suggested urgency. The security employee slowly adjusted his route through the restaurant, stopping occasionally to answer simple questions from customers or help move an extra chair for a large family. His relaxed manner reassured everyone around him while allowing him to observe the dining room more closely. Ethan turned his attention back to Noah, who proudly slid the completed paper maze across the table. "Finished," the little boy announced with a wide smile. Ethan examined it with genuine interest before giving an approving nod. "I knew you could do it." Noah laughed and reached for a bread roll. "Can I show Grace when she comes back?" Ethan smiled warmly. "I think she would like that very much." The conversation remained light and cheerful because Ethan understood something every good parent eventually learns. Children often borrow their emotions from the adults around them. If he remained calm, Noah would remain calm as well. Across the room, Grace noticed another small detail. The guest quietly removed a long rectangular object from inside his heavy coat and placed it inside a compact zippered case beneath the table. she still refused to make assumptions. Many harmless items shared similar shapes. What mattered now was not guessing what the object might be. What mattered was following the restaurant's safety procedures with patience and professionalism. Grace approached the manager while carrying an empty coffee pot that naturally required refilling. Standing beside the service station, she quietly signed another brief message below the counter where customers could not see. The object has been moved into a case. Continue observation. Please contact building security as a precaution. The manager acknowledged the message with a slight nod before calmly stepping into the office near the kitchen, where he discreetly contacted building security using established procedures. No alarms sounded. No announcements interrupted dinner. Every action remained measured and respectful. A few moments later, 2 additional security professionals entered through separate public entrances dressed in ordinary business attire. To everyone else, they appeared to be late dinner guests looking for a table. Grace admired how smoothly the entire team worked together. No one rushed. No one attempted to become a hero. Each person simply fulfilled a small responsibility, trusting the others to do the same. Ethan quietly recognized the same principle. Throughout his career, the strongest organizations he had ever built were never guided by panic. They succeeded because ordinary people performed ordinary duties with extraordinary consistency when it mattered most. Looking toward Grace once again, he realized she possessed exactly that rare quality. She transformed uncertainty into quiet confidence, allowing an entire dining room to continue sharing meals, celebrating birthdays, and creating happy memories without ever realizing that someone had been thoughtfully protecting their peace all along. Several quiet minutes passed before the evening reached its turning point. Grace carried a tray with fresh coffee toward a nearby table while discreetly observing the natural flow of the dining room. Nothing appeared rushed. Families continued sharing stories over dinner. A young couple laughed softly beside the window, and the birthday celebration near the fireplace had just begun serving cake. The atmosphere remained exactly as it should have been. That calm was worth protecting. Near the entrance, the additional security professionals blended effortlessly into the restaurant. One appeared to be reading the menu while waiting for a table. Another quietly greeted the hostess before taking a seat in the waiting area. Neither attracted attention. Their presence reflected careful planning rather than dramatic action. Grace admired that approach because she believed people deserved to feel safe without feeling frightened. Ethan noticed the same coordinated professionalism. He quietly thanked himself for choosing patience instead of reacting emotionally. Throughout his business career, he had learned that rushing toward conclusions often created greater problems than the situation itself. Tonight, that lesson mattered far more than any boardroom decision he had ever made. Noah looked up from his meal and smiled. "Dad, this is the best mashed potatoes in the city." Ethan laughed warmly. "I think you tell me that every Friday." "Because it is true," Noah answered proudly before taking another bite. Ethan smiled, grateful that his son remained completely relaxed. Across the room, the guest quietly stood from his chair, lifted the compact zippered case, and walked toward the front counter. Grace noticed the movement immediately, but kept her expression calm. At nearly the same moment, the security professionals casually adjusted their positions while continuing to appear like ordinary customers. The restaurant manager stepped toward the entrance with a welcoming smile, greeting the guest exactly as he greeted everyone else. The conversation remained friendly, respectful, and completely unhurried. Grace continued serving nearby tables, allowing the professionals to perform their responsibilities without interference. Moments later, one member of the building security team politely asked whether the guest would mind speaking with him in the lobby for a brief routine conversation. The guest agreed without hesitation. No raised voices interrupted the dining room. No frightened reactions spread among the families enjoying dinner. Within less than a minute, the guest, accompanied by security personnel, quietly exited the restaurant through the main entrance. The entire exchange felt so ordinary that many diners never even looked up from their meals. Grace finally released the slow breath she had been holding. She continued delivering meals exactly as before, refusing to celebrate too early because professionalism meant waiting until every detail had been confirmed. A few minutes later, the restaurant manager returned from the lobby and approached Grace while carrying a stack of clean menus. His smile revealed quiet relief. Speaking softly enough that only she could hear, he said, "Everything has been resolved. There was no immediate danger to our guests. The item inside the case was safely identified and handled through proper procedures after additional questions and verification. Thank you for remaining calm." Grace simply nodded. She did not ask for details. She did not seek recognition. She returned to Noah's table carrying a fresh glass of lemonade, as though it were the most important task in the world. Ethan accepted the drink with sincere appreciation before looking into Grace's eyes for a brief moment. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. In that silent exchange, both understood that the greatest victory of the evening was not dramatic heroism. It was the simple fact that dozens of families had continued sharing dinner, celebrating birthdays, and making happy memories without ever realizing how many quiet acts of wisdom, restraint, and teamwork had protected their peaceful night. The gentle rhythm of the restaurant slowly returned to complete normality, although very few people realized anything unusual had happened at all. A family near the fireplace continued singing happy birthday as a chocolate cake arrived with glowing candles. An elderly couple lingered over coffee while discussing their vacation plans. Friends laughed together near the windows overlooking Manhattan's evening lights. The quiet success of the evening was measured not by dramatic headlines, but by the complete absence of fear. Grace continued serving every table with the same calm professionalism she had shown since the beginning of her shift. She checked on a young mother whose toddler needed an extra napkin, refilled fresh lemonade for Noah without being asked, and thanked departing guests with genuine warmth. Nothing about her expression suggested she expected praise. She simply believed that helping people feel safe and welcome was part of the same responsibility. Ethan watched her from across the dining room with growing respect. Throughout his career, he had met military leaders, emergency planners, corporate executives, and crisis consultants. Many possessed impressive knowledge. Very few carried the quiet confidence Grace had demonstrated during the past 30 minutes. She had never tried to control the room. Instead, she had protected its peace without allowing anyone to lose it. Noah happily finished the last bite of mashed potatoes before looking up with an excited smile. "Dad, can I show Grace my drawing?" Ethan laughed softly. "I think she would like that." The little boy held up the completed maze and a small sketch he had added beside it, showing a smiling waitress carrying a tray with the words "Thank you" written in colorful pencil. Grace approached the table just as Noah proudly presented the paper. "I made this for you," he said. Grace's face brightened with sincere surprise. "That is one of the nicest gifts I have received all week." Noah smiled even wider. "You always remember my favorite lemonade." Grace carefully accepted the drawing as though it were something priceless. "Then I will remember this too." Ethan noticed how naturally she treated a child's handmade picture with the same respect she gave every guest. Nothing about her kindness depended on a person's age, wealth, or importance. A few moments later, the restaurant manager quietly approached their table after confirming everything had been fully documented with building security. "Mr. Walker," he said warmly, "thank you for remaining so composed this evening. Your thoughtful observation allowed us to respond through our normal safety procedures without disrupting anyone's dinner." Ethan gently shook his head. "The credit belongs to your team." He glanced toward Grace. "Especially your waitress." The manager smiled knowingly. Grace has always believed that staying calm is sometimes the most valuable service we can provide. Grace looked slightly embarrassed by the attention and politely excused herself to welcome another family entering through the front doors. Ethan watched her greet complete strangers with exactly the same genuine smile she had offered him and Noah earlier that evening. There was no difference. Every guest received the same kindness. Every person mattered equally. As Noah carefully folded his drawing supplies back into his backpack, Ethan quietly realized something unexpected. The evening had begun with concern over a possible danger. It was ending with a far more meaningful discovery. Real courage did not always appear in extraordinary moments. Sometimes it revealed itself through ordinary people who chose patience over panic, wisdom over attention, and quiet. Service over recognition. Looking toward Grace one more time, Ethan understood that the greatest act of leadership he had witnessed all year had not taken place inside a corporate boardroom. It had happened in a neighborhood restaurant, where one waitress quietly protected the peace of everyone around her simply by refusing to let fear become louder than kindness. As the evening gradually settled into its final hour, Ashford Grill became quieter. Several families prepared to leave. Servers cleared empty tables, and the soft jazz drifting through hidden speakers seemed even gentler than before. The tension that had quietly existed beneath the surface had completely disappeared, leaving behind nothing except the ordinary comfort every restaurant hoped its guests would remember. Grace carefully placed Noah's drawing inside a small folder she kept for handwritten notes and children's artwork that guests occasionally gave her. She believed every sincere gesture deserved to be preserved. While organizing the service station, she smiled to herself, grateful that the happiest memory of the evening belonged to a little boy proudly sharing a simple drawing rather than to the situation that almost disrupted everyone's dinner. Ethan noticed the folder resting beside the register as he prepared to pay the bill. "You keep them?" he asked with quiet curiosity. Grace looked toward the drawing before answering. "Every single one. Children usually forget these moments. I do not think they should disappear." Ethan glanced once more at Noah, who had begun reading a book while waiting for dessert. For a brief moment, he imagined his son returning years later as a young man, perhaps never remembering the picture he had drawn that evening. Yet someone else would remember it for him. There was something deeply comforting about that thought. Grace returned with warm apple pie and vanilla ice cream for Noah, placing the plate gently in front of him. The little boy's eyes widened with excitement. "I did not order this." Grace smiled kindly. "The kitchen wanted to thank you for sharing your artwork." Noah immediately looked toward his father for permission. Ethan nodded with a warm smile. "I think accepting kindness is just as important as giving it." Noah happily picked up his spoon before pausing. Looking at Grace, he suddenly raised both hands and formed several simple signs. "Thank you." Grace answered in the same language without hesitation. "You are very welcome." Ethan blinked with surprise. Until that moment, he had assumed Grace knew only the few emergency signs he had used earlier. Instead, her hands moved naturally, smoothly, and with complete confidence. Noah's face lit up with excitement. He continued signing another short sentence. "My teacher says practice helps people feel included." Grace smiled even more warmly before replying. "Your teacher is absolutely right." Ethan watched the silent conversation unfold with genuine amazement. Neither of them appeared to be translating word by word. They communicated naturally, comfortably, and with obvious familiarity. Noah laughed after Grace playfully signed that dessert always tasted better after finishing vegetables. "She signs faster than my teacher," Noah said proudly. Ethan looked at Grace with new curiosity. "Where did you learn American Sign Language?" Grace hesitated for only a moment before answering modestly. "Several years ago, I volunteered at a community center that served children and adults who were deaf or hard of hearing. I thought I would stay for one summer. I stayed for almost 4 years." Ethan listened carefully as she continued. "I realized communication is not only about words. Sometimes making another person feel understood is the greatest kindness you can offer." Those simple words stayed with Ethan long after she returned to another table. He had spent decades building companies by teaching people how to communicate more efficiently. Yet Grace had quietly revealed something far more important. Communication was not about speaking the loudest or the fastest. It was about making sure another human being never felt invisible. Watching Noah smile as he practiced a few more signs to himself, Ethan realized that the silent message he had shared earlier in the evening had accomplished far more than helping prevent unnecessary panic. It had unexpectedly introduced his family to someone whose greatest gift was not extraordinary observation alone. It was the rare ability to help people feel seen, safe, and understood without ever asking for recognition in return. Closing time arrived a little later than usual, and the dining room gradually emptied until only a handful of guests remained beneath the warm amber lights. Grace quietly wiped the final table near the window while another server stacked polished glasses behind the counter. The hurried energy of the dinner rush had faded into a peaceful silence that always reminded her why she loved working evenings. She believed people revealed their true character at the end of a long day. Ethan remained seated after paying the bill, watching Noah carefully pack his coloring pencils into his small backpack. The little boy suddenly looked toward Grace and smiled. Without saying a word, he raised his hands again and signed a simple question. "Will you still work here next Friday?" Grace smiled before answering in the same quiet language. "Yes, I usually work every Friday evening." Noah grinned with obvious relief. Good. I want to learn more signs. Ethan watched the exchange with growing admiration. Grace never made Noah feel as though she were teaching him. She simply spoke to him in the language he had chosen, allowing confidence to replace uncertainty. It was the same thoughtful patience she had shown throughout the evening. As Noah walked toward the entrance, he turned back one final time and waved. Grace returned the wave before signing, "Have a safe trip home." The little boy laughed proudly because he understood every word. After Noah stepped outside, Ethan remained near the hostess stand for a quiet moment. "May I ask you something?" he said gently. Grace nodded. "Of course." Ethan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Most people would have reacted very differently tonight. "You stayed remarkably calm from beginning to end. I have been wondering what gave you that confidence." Grace rested one hand lightly on the counter before answering. "The community center where I volunteered taught us something during our first week. They told us that fear spreads faster than facts, but calm spreads faster than fear if someone chooses it first." Ethan listened without interrupting. Grace continued with a thoughtful smile. Many of the children there could not hear an alarm, a shouted warning, or a crowd becoming frightened. They depended on people around them remaining calm enough to communicate clearly. After a while, you learn that staying steady is one of the greatest gifts you can give another person. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment. Those words felt unexpectedly personal. Since becoming a single father several years earlier, he had often believed his greatest responsibility was providing security through financial success. Yet tonight he had witnessed another kind of security entirely. It came from presence, patience, and the ability to help others feel safe without creating unnecessary fear. Grace reached into the small folder beside the register and carefully placed Noah's drawing between protective sleeves. "I keep these because they remind me why small moments matter," she said softly. "Most people remember extraordinary days. I think ordinary days deserve to be remembered too." Ethan smiled. "I have spent years building companies that people recognize around the world. Somehow my son will probably remember this restaurant much longer." Grace laughed quietly. "That is because children remember how places make them feel." Those simple words remained with Ethan as he stepped outside into the cool Manhattan night. Noah slipped his small hand into his father's, happily practicing the new signs he had learned while walking toward the waiting car. Ethan glanced back through the restaurant window one final time. Grace had already returned to cleaning tables, speaking kindly with coworkers, and preparing the dining room for tomorrow as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet Ethan understood that the rarest people rarely announced their greatest strengths. They simply carried them into ordinary places every single day, changing lives so quietly that many never realized they had been changed at all. The following Friday arrived with crisp autumn air sweeping through Manhattan, carrying golden leaves along the sidewalks as office. Workers hurried home beneath a sky slowly turning shades of orange and deep blue. Inside Ashford Grill, the familiar warmth welcomed guests escaping the evening chill. Grace adjusted her neatly pressed white apron, greeted her co-workers with a cheerful smile, and quietly prepared for another busy dinner service. Nothing about the restaurant looked different from any other Friday, yet she found herself wondering whether the father and son from the previous week might return. She quickly dismissed the thought. One lesson years of restaurant work had taught her was never to expect yesterday's guests to become tomorrow's friends. Every evening deserved to begin with a clean heart and equal kindness toward everyone who walked through the door. Just after 6 o'clock, the entrance bell chimed softly. Grace looked up from arranging fresh flowers on the hostess stand and immediately recognized Noah's bright smile before she even noticed Ethan beside him. The little boy lifted one hand enthusiastically and signed before speaking aloud. "Good evening." Grace answered with the same sign before adding a warm smile. "Welcome back." Noah laughed with obvious excitement. "Dad," she remembered. Ethan smiled quietly. "I had a feeling she would." Grace led them to the same booth near the large front windows where city lights would soon sparkle across the glass. Before handing Noah his menu, she signed another short sentence. "Did you practice this week?" Noah proudly nodded. "Every day?" Ethan watched the brief exchange with genuine admiration. The conversation flowed so naturally that it almost seemed effortless. While Noah eagerly described learning new signs at school, Grace listened with complete attention, responding in both spoken English and American Sign Language so the little boy could practice without feeling self-conscious. It was a small gesture, yet Ethan noticed how confidently Noah communicated when someone met him exactly where he was instead of expecting him to adjust. A few moments later, Grace returned with Noah's favorite lemonade before he even ordered it. "I remembered," she said simply. Noah smiled. "You remember everything." Grace laughed softly. "Only the important things." As she walked toward another table, Ethan found himself reflecting on those words. Throughout his career, he had relied on complicated databases, reports, and digital systems to remember thousands of business details. Grace relied on genuine attention. Somehow her memory seemed warmer because it came from caring rather than collecting information. Dinner unfolded peacefully. Noah excitedly demonstrated several new signs he had learned during the week, occasionally asking Grace to correct his hand movements whenever she passed their table. She always did so with gentle patience, praising his progress instead of pointing out mistakes. Ethan quietly realized that confidence often grew fastest in environments where encouragement arrived before correction. Later in the evening, while Grace refilled Ethan's coffee, he asked the question that had remained in his thoughts all week. "You mentioned volunteering for almost 4 years. Most people would describe that as a significant part of their life. What made you stay so long?" Grace rested the coffee pot gently against her serving tray before answering. "At first I believed I was helping other people learn to communicate. After a few months I realized they were teaching me something much greater." Ethan looked genuinely curious. Grace smiled thoughtfully. "They taught me that everyone wants to be understood before they want to be admired. Once I learned that, every conversation became different." Ethan remained silent as those words settled deeply into his mind. Looking across the table at Noah smiling while practicing another sign to himself, he quietly wondered whether the most valuable lessons in life truly arrived in classrooms, boardrooms, or universities. Perhaps sometimes they arrived carrying a serving tray through an ordinary neighborhood restaurant, patiently reminding strangers that feeling seen was one of the greatest gifts any human being could offer another. The quiet tradition continued without either of them ever planning it. Friday evenings gradually became something Noah looked forward to throughout the entire week, long before Ethan finished his final business meeting each Friday afternoon. His son would already be asking whether they were leaving on time for dinner at Ashford Grill. Ethan always smiled because he knew Noah was not asking about the food. He was asking about the conversations waiting inside the familiar restaurant. Grace greeted them each week with the same genuine warmth, never making their arrival feel expected or routine. To her, every guest deserved to feel like the most important person entering through the front door at that moment. One Friday evening, Noah arrived carrying a small notebook instead of his usual coloring pages. As soon as Grace approached the table, he proudly opened it to reveal dozens of carefully practiced American Sign Language sketches. Each page contained new words he had been learning after school. Grace looked through every page with sincere admiration, praising his careful effort rather than his speed. "You have been practicing a great deal," she signed before speaking the words aloud. Noah nodded enthusiastically. "I wanted to surprise you." Grace smiled. "You certainly did." Ethan quietly watched the exchange while sipping his coffee. He realized Noah had become noticeably more confident during the past several weeks. At school, his teachers had recently mentioned that he volunteered more often during class discussions and seemed more comfortable helping classmates whenever someone struggled with an assignment. Ethan suspected the quiet conversations inside this restaurant had contributed far more than anyone realized. As dinner continued, Noah paused for a thoughtful moment before asking Grace another question through signs. "Why did you decide to learn our language?" Grace gently rested her serving tray against an empty chair before answering. "Because someone once made me feel included when I was the person who felt different." Noah tilted his head with curiosity. Grace smiled softly before continuing. "When I was in college, I volunteered at a summer community event. One little girl who was deaf wanted to join every activity, but many volunteers did not know how to communicate with her. I learned just enough signs to spend one afternoon together. Before I left, she hugged me and signed, 'Thank you for seeing me.' I realized she was not thanking me for learning signs. She was thanking me for making sure she did not feel invisible." Noah looked down quietly at his notebook. Ethan noticed the thoughtful expression on his son's face. Grace continued gently. "After that day, I kept learning because I never wanted another person to feel left out simply because communication required a little more effort. Ethan found himself unexpectedly moved by those words. Throughout his career, he had often measured success through numbers, growth, and achievements. Grace measured success differently. She counted moments when another person felt welcome, understood, or included. Somehow her way seemed far more lasting. Before returning to another table, Grace carefully handed Noah's notebook back to him. "Keep practicing," she encouraged. "Every new sign you learn is another way to help someone feel they belong." Noah smiled with quiet determination. "I will." Ethan watched Grace continue serving guests across the dining room with the same patient kindness she offered everyone. She never announced the lessons she carried. She simply lived them. Looking around the restaurant filled with ordinary families sharing ordinary dinners, Ethan slowly realized that the greatest teachers rarely stood behind podiums or appeared on television. Sometimes they carried serving trays through crowded dining rooms, changing lives one quiet conversation at a time without ever expecting the world to notice. Several months quietly passed, and Friday evenings at Ashford Grill became part of the Walker family's routine. Even during the busiest weeks filled with investor meetings, international conferences, and endless business decisions, Ethan always protected one evening for Noah. More than once, his executive assistant suggested scheduling important dinners on Friday because it was the only night certain international partners were available. Ethan politely declined every request. He had learned that success meant very little if it required sacrificing the moments his son would remember forever. Noah noticed the consistency, even if he never mentioned it directly. He simply assumed Friday belonged to the restaurant, to Grace, and to the peaceful conversations that always seemed to make the entire week feel lighter. One evening, after Noah finished practicing several new signs with Grace, he quietly asked his father a thoughtful question while she served another table. "Dad, why do you always look happier here than at your office?" Ethan smiled with gentle surprise. Children often notice truths adults overlooked. He considered the question carefully before answering. "Because this is one of the few places where nobody expects anything from me except to be a father." Noah nodded slowly, accepting the answer with the simple wisdom children often possess. A few minutes later, Grace returned carrying warm soup for another guest before stopping briefly beside their table. Ethan looked up with quiet gratitude. "May I ask you something?" Grace smiled politely. "Certainly." Ethan rested both hands around his coffee cup before speaking. "Have you ever considered working somewhere else? With your communication skills and your ability to remain calm under pressure, I imagine many organizations would be fortunate to have someone like you." Grace looked around the dining room before answering. Families were laughing together. A grandfather patiently helped his granddaughter color a picture. An elderly couple shared dessert beneath the soft candlelight. Every table carried its own quiet story. "I have received a few opportunities," she admitted. Some offered more money. Others offered impressive titles. Ethan listened carefully, but I always asked myself the same question. She smiled gently. "Where can I make the greatest difference to the people I meet every day?" Ethan followed her gaze across the restaurant. Grace continued softly. "Most people think extraordinary opportunities happen in extraordinary places. I am not sure that is true anymore. Every evening someone walks through these doors carrying something invisible. Sometimes it is loneliness, sometimes grief, sometimes fear, sometimes joy they hope someone will celebrate with them. If I can make even one person leave feeling lighter than when they arrived, I think I have done meaningful work." Ethan remained silent. During decades of building companies, he had spoken often about creating value. Grace described value in a completely different way. She measured it through human moments instead of financial results. Noah suddenly signed a short sentence toward Grace before speaking it aloud. "You make people smile." Grace answered with a grateful laugh. "That is a wonderful goal for any day." Ethan watched Noah beam with pride after understanding her response without needing help. In that quiet exchange, he realized the greatest gift Grace had given his son was not American Sign Language itself. She had given him confidence to communicate with anyone willing to listen. As Grace walked toward another table carrying fresh coffee, Ethan found himself reflecting on the remarkable simplicity of her philosophy. Leadership was not always found in boardrooms, corner offices, or public speeches. Sometimes leadership appeared in someone who consistently chose kindness, patience, and presence quietly changing the direction of another person's life one ordinary evening at a time, without ever expecting applause for doing so. One quiet Friday near the beginning of winter, Ethan arrived at Ashford Grill a few minutes earlier than usual. Noah was attending an overnight science program with his school, leaving Ethan unexpectedly alone for the first Friday evening in months. The familiar restaurant felt different without his son's cheerful voice filling the booth by the window. Grace noticed the empty seat immediately as she welcomed him with the same warm smile she always offered. "Where is your partner for dinner tonight?" she asked kindly. Ethan smiled. "He is busy teaching his classmates how to build a model bridge." Grace laughed softly. "Then I hope they are listening to him." Ethan settled into the booth while Grace brought his usual coffee without needing to ask. The restaurant moved through its familiar rhythm as families gathered, friends celebrated birthdays, and soft music drifted through the dining room. Yet for the first time since that unforgettable evening months earlier, Ethan found himself with enough quiet to think instead of simply watching Noah enjoy dinner. When Grace returned to refill his coffee, he looked up thoughtfully. "May I ask you something a little unusual?" Grace nodded. "Of course." Ethan hesitated before continuing. "The evening we first met changed more than I realized. At first I thought it was because of the situation itself. Later I understood it was because of the way you handled it. I have spent months trying to understand why it affected me so deeply." Grace rested the coffee pot lightly against the edge of the table before answering. Sometimes one calm moment arrives exactly when someone is ready to see life differently. Ethan smiled quietly. "Perhaps." He looked around the dining room before continuing. "After that evening, I started changing small things inside my company." Grace listened with genuine curiosity. "We introduced communication workshops focused on listening before responding. Managers now spend time learning how to recognize when employees feel overlooked instead of simply measuring productivity. We also expanded accessibility training because I realized inclusion should never depend on circumstance." Grace's eyes reflected quiet admiration. "Those sound like meaningful changes." Ethan nodded. "The surprising part is that morale improved. Employee turnover decreased. Teams cooperate more naturally now." He laughed softly to himself. "For years I believed better systems created stronger people. Now I think stronger relationships create better systems." Grace smiled with quiet satisfaction. People rarely forget how someone made them feel. Ethan recognized the familiar sentence immediately. She had lived by those words every Friday since they met. Looking around the restaurant, he suddenly understood why the atmosphere always felt so welcoming. It was not the elegant lighting or the carefully prepared meals. It was the culture Grace quietly helped create through hundreds of ordinary interactions that most people never noticed individually. Before returning to another table, Grace spoke gently. "Kindness has an interesting habit. People who receive it often begin giving it to others without realizing where it started." Ethan remained thoughtful long. After she walked away, he realized the changes inside his company had not happened because employees attended a seminar or followed a new policy. They happened because one waitress had reminded him that leadership always begins with the way one person treats another. Looking through the restaurant window at softly falling snow, Ethan understood that the greatest investment he had made that year was not measured in dollars, buildings, or technology. It had begun with a silent conversation across a crowded dining room and continued every time he chose understanding before authority, patience before urgency, and people before position. Winter settled comfortably over Manhattan, and Ashford Grill glowed even more warmly against the cold evenings outside. The restaurant had become more than a favorite place for Ethan and Noah. It had quietly become a reminder of the values they wanted to carry into every part of their lives. Friday dinners were no longer simply about sharing a meal. They were about slowing down, reconnecting, and remembering that the most meaningful conversations often happened in ordinary places. One evening shortly before the holidays, Noah arrived carrying a carefully wrapped package no larger than a hardcover book. He held it close throughout dinner, smiling each time Grace walked past their table. Ethan noticed his excitement, but chose not to ask questions, sensing his son wanted the surprise to remain his own. After dessert, Noah finally stood and walked toward the service station where Grace was organizing clean menus for the following shift. He held out the small package with both hands. "This is for you," he said before signing the same words in American Sign Language. Grace looked genuinely surprised. For me? Noah nodded eagerly. You have to open it. Grace carefully untied the ribbon and folded back the wrapping paper. Inside rested a beautiful leather journal with a simple embossed message on the cover that read, "Every story matters." Tucked inside the first page was Noah's handwritten note. "Thank you for teaching me that listening is another way of caring." Grace read the words slowly before looking back at Noah with quiet emotion, shining in her eyes. "This may be one of the most thoughtful gifts I have ever received." Noah smiled proudly. "Dad helped me choose the journal, but I wrote the note myself." Ethan walked over with a warm smile. He insisted on finding something that matched the way you treat people. Grace gently ran her hand across the journal's cover before closing it carefully. "I know exactly what I will use this for." Noah tilted his head with curiosity. Grace smiled. "Every time a guest shares a story that reminds me why kindness matters, I will write it down. I never want to forget those moments." Ethan quietly admired her answer. Most people would have focused on the gift itself. Grace immediately focused on the people it would help her remember. Later that evening, as the restaurant became quieter, Ethan asked one final question that had remained in his heart for many months. "Do you ever think about the first night we met?" Grace smiled gently. "Sometimes." Ethan laughed softly. "I have replayed it more times than I can count." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "The interesting part is that I rarely think about the concern itself anymore." Ethan looked curious. "What do you think about instead?" Grace glanced around the dining room, where families continued sharing meals beneath warm lights and soft music. "I think about what happened afterward. A father and his son kept returning, not because something frightening happened, but because something meaningful did." Ethan quietly lowered his eyes. She was right. The evening that had begun with uncertainty had long since become a story about trust, patience, and human connection instead of fear. Looking at Noah happily helping another young child learn a simple greeting in American Sign Language near the waiting area, Ethan realized the true outcome of that first Friday had never been measured by what had been quietly prevented. It had been measured by everything beautiful that continued growing afterward. Sometimes the greatest victories are the ones that allow ordinary life to keep unfolding with hope, kindness, and quiet dignity, leaving behind not memories of fear, but memories of people who chose to care for one another when it mattered most. Another spring quietly arrived in Manhattan, and although seasons continued changing outside the windows of Ashford Grill, some traditions remained beautifully unchanged. Every Friday evening, a familiar father and son walked through the front door, and every Friday evening, a waitress welcomed them with the same genuine smile that had never depended on the circumstances of the day. The restaurant had become a place where success was never measured by titles, wealth, or recognition. It was measured by conversations remembered long after the plates had been cleared away. Noah had grown noticeably taller over the past year. His American Sign Language had become so natural that he often greeted new classmates who were deaf or hard of hearing before anyone else realized communication might require a different approach. His teachers frequently wrote to Ethan, describing how Noah instinctively noticed children sitting alone during lunch and quietly invited them to join his table. Ethan always smiled when reading those messages because he knew exactly where his son had learned that kind of leadership. It had not come from a textbook or a business seminar. It had grown from countless ordinary evenings watching one waitress make every person feel welcome without asking for anything in return. One Friday, after dinner had ended, Noah walked over to Grace and signed with complete confidence. "Thank you for teaching me to notice people." Grace smiled warmly before answering with the same quiet grace she had always carried. "You learned because you wanted to. I only reminded you to keep your eyes and your heart open." Ethan stood beside them, watching the silent conversation unfold with deep gratitude. Months earlier, he had believed that his greatest responsibility as a father was protecting his son from difficult moments. Now he understood something far more meaningful. His responsibility was also to introduce Noah to people whose character would quietly shape the man he would someday become. Before leaving, Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and removed a simple business card. He placed it gently on the counter beside Grace. "If you ever need anything," he said sincerely, "whether it is for you, your community center, or someone who simply deserves another opportunity, please call me." Grace looked at the card for a moment before smiling. "Thank you. I will remember your kindness." She did not promise to use it. She simply appreciated the gesture, exactly as she appreciated every thoughtful moment life quietly offered. Ethan understood why. Some people collected favors. Grace collected trust. As Ethan and Noah stepped outside into the cool evening air, Noah looked up at his father and signed one final sentence before speaking it aloud. "I'm glad we came here that first night." Ethan smiled gently and answered with the same language that had unexpectedly connected two strangers so many months before. "Me too." They walked slowly down the sidewalk beneath the glowing city lights, their conversation continuing with both words and signs, carrying forward lessons that would remain with them far longer than they could imagine. Inside the restaurant, Grace carefully placed another handwritten memory into the leather journal Noah had given her. She closed the cover softly before preparing another table for new guests she had never met. Somewhere among them would be another story waiting to begin. And perhaps that was life's quiet miracle. The people who change our future rarely arrive wearing crowns or standing on stages. Sometimes they wear a white apron, carry a serving tray, listen before speaking, remain calm when others cannot, and remind us that the strongest hearts are often the ones the world almost overlooks. Because in the end, the quiet ones are never truly ordinary.